It would be fair to say that anybody setting out to create a constitution would not produce something like the British Constitution. It's unique in the world because it has arisen over a long period by a process of evolution rather than being actually drafted at one particular moment in time. The process of evolution for many years happened largely as a result of governmental response to periodic crises. Good examples are Magna Carta in 1215 and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Other developments occurred more peacefully, such as the gradual emergence of growth of Parliament from the 13th century, although a crisis nevertheless ensued in the 17th century on the relationship between King and Parliament. Since the early 19th century, the United Kingdom has gradually become a representative democracy with the emergence of universal suffrage, the shifting of power within Parliament from the House of Lords to the Commons, and the creation of a coherent system of local government. In recent years, the pace of change has increased, particularly under the Blair government of 1997 to 2007, with devolved institutions in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the Human Rights Act of 1998, and the removal of most hereditary peers from the House of Lords. So where did it all begin? It is possible to trace the beginnings of the British Constitution back some 1400 years to the beginning of the 7th century, when King Ethelbert of Kent produced the first extant Anglo-Saxon law code. The history of the period from AD 400 to 600 is obscure, and most of the facts on this subject are in dispute, but Britain south of the Hadrian's Wall ceased to be a province of the Roman Empire and came under the dominance of incomers from what is now North Germany and neighbouring areas of Holland and Denmark. When the written record begins to appear in the 7th century, a number of kingdoms had emerged under rulers whose main role was to be war leaders of their people, but who also had a responsibility for ensuring the protection and well-being of their subjects, particularly their weaker subjects, and also as the givers of justice. And ultimately, most prerogative powers, i.e. the powers of the monarch as monarch, can be traced back to this period. The obvious one is the monarch's relationship with the armed forces, who owe allegiance directly to the monarch rather than to the government of the day. In the 14th century, Parliament was considered sufficiently significant for those who deposed Edward II in 1327 and Richard II in 1399 to summon parliaments of rather questionable validity to ratify the king's abdication and accept their successors as the rightful rulers. So we get an increasing role for Parliament as a law-making body and also as a body which approved the grant of extraordinary revenues to the king for a particular purpose. However, this was a long way from parliamentary democracy as we know it today. Parliaments were summoned by the king, and often only when he was in need of extraordinary revenues, so there might be considerable gaps between parliaments. Frequently, the legislation produced by a parliament represented concessions made by the king in order to gain the revenues. A good example is the Statute of Treasons, which was passed by the Parliament of 1351 and still forms the basis of British treason law. The king also controlled who was summoned to a parliament by a written summons, and even when the representatives of the shires and boroughs were summoned, they were not elected by those they represented, but rather chosen by the local institutions. A parliament only lasted while its business was being conducted and was then dissolved by the king. So Parliament thus developed very much in an ad hoc fashion. In consequence, its powers and position remained unclear until direct conflict developed between King and Parliament on issues which included the questions of, could the king raise revenue without the approval of a Parliament? Could the king legislate independently of Parliament? And which of the king's prerogative powers, which derived from his ancient roles as protector and defender of his people and lawgiver, could be exercised by him alone, and which only in conjunction with a parliament?